We're cold hardy cultivars. I'll just be focusing on Marquette, La Crescent, Frontenac Blanc, and a little bit on Petite Pearl, although I don't have a lot of experience with it. All right, so as I said, those varieties we'll be focusing on, and we'll just touch on some of the cold hardiness, the vine characteristics, some of the disease resistance in these vines, fruit, wine characters, overall potentials and risks. So one thing to note about just vines and their general performance altogether, different sites will make the same variety grow differently. So you can have the same variety, whether it's Marquette or Foch or something, and two different sites are going to impact the way that vine grows in a different way, depending on soil type, moisture availability, disease pressure, all these things. So for me, it's always noticeable in the way the vigor of those vines, so depending on that soil type. A grower, they can really affect that vine's vigor with the amount of buds that they save and the number of shoots that are kept on that vine. So the more shoots that you keep, the less energy there's available to all of those shoots, so the shoots can actually slow themselves down by having more shoots and more fruits, right? Having more sinks for all that energy will slow down the vine. Whereas the opposite, if you want to increase the vigor of a vine, it's growing too slowly, you keep fewer shoots and fewer fruits, right? That's a basic principle, basic tenet in grape growing. Also, the ground fertility and moisture content are really going to largely determine the vine's vigor as well, in combination with those other factors. So what we call this is the genetic and environment combination. It's the equation that really affects that phenotype of the vine or your physical expression of those genes. So the way the shoot looks or how big a cluster looks, that would be the phenotype. And it's coming from both the environment and the genetics. It's hard to separate the two. A vine's hardiness, it can definitely decrease when excessive moisture and nitrogen are available, especially long into the season. So when you're seeing lots of rain in a season like this maybe, or long into the fall and your ground is staying wet longer, you're going to get a lot of nitrogen, especially if your organic matter is relatively high. So what ends up happening is these bull canes can start to form. These are shoots that are fairly thick, and I touched on it before, but we're generally looking for bull canes to not happen if possible, and bull canes would be things that are thicker than a Sharpie marker. And we'd rather see that nice normal diameter cane that somewhere fits between a pen and a Sharpie marker. If it's thicker than that, it's too thick. If it's thinner than that, it can be maybe acceptable, but it's generally too thin. So we're just looking for the Goldilocks, right? The Goldilocks canes, the ones that are just right. Here would be sort of a comparison of what I would call, this would be bully growth, bull canes right here, this thick one, and this lateral shoot is the more in the moderate zone or maybe less than moderate, but that's a lateral shoot off of a bull cane. And then here's a nice regular shoot, a nice Goldilocks sized cane in the middle, and then here would be another bull cane. Notice the large inner nodes here. I mean, there's one node here and one node here, and in the same amount of space, you've got 3 or 4 nodes on this regular shoot versus the 1 or 2 down here. So that really impacts how that vine is pruned and how it's cared for, and just try to avoid these pitfalls if possible. And the way you do that is by keeping more shoots, for example. This is just a quick map I've seen this, Mike White was the first one that I've seen present this soil map, and it shows the organic matter distribution of the US. And notice how black and rich we are throughout Minnesota and Iowa. So a lot of times our vines are growing way too vigorously in those types of soils. And then look at like California, how little it is there. That would be right around here, Sonoma and Napa. This would be the Central Valley. You know, very low organics. But then Oregon has a nice wine industry. And look at them, they're pretty heavy too. So they've figured out how to grow these grapes in different methods to really tame those vines down or increase the number of shoots. And I'm sure you've seen some of those funky trellis systems that exist, the split canopies and whatnot, where they can fit double the amount of fruit in the same amount of row space and still get the job done. So we maybe should look at some of those things, or just think of devigorating techniques in general. Like even like root ripping might be an option for some of us, to rip one side of the vine's roots every other year. This is just another quick picture that I wanted to show you of Mulder's chart here. It's giving you an idea of how nutrients can interact with each other. So on the outside you see all the elements, nitrogen and zinc and whatnot all. You got potassium, and copper and everything, and you can see that the red, where the red links up with another one, that's where they're antagonizing. So that means if you're adding more iron, for example, to the ground or to the vine, it might be antagonizing the uptake of calcium or magnesium or copper or any of these other elements. In certain cases, like, well, nitrogen here, you add nitrogen, it might increase the magnesium, but by increasing magnesium, you might be decreasing calcium. So whenever you're doing fertilizing applications, you should go about it slowly and carefully at first and learn, try to understand what is going to happen. And the best recommendation I would say is do side-by-side trials. If you think you need some fertilizer, do a certain amount of vineyard and leave a certain amount of vineyard undone so that you can see some comparison, because otherwise you don't know if it's really doing you good or maybe it's even doing you bad. But we certainly don't want to waste money when we don't have to, when it's such a labor-intensive job already. But in some cases fertilizers are good, but just so you're aware that there's all these factors that are going on. Checking the bud survival, we did talk about this in the last talk just a little bit. If we bring them indoors, those buds can warm up and they can actually show their damage. They're not going to show that brown as easily because they're like in a freezer environment. Once you've done that, you can take your razor blade and magnification, even just a simple, you can see it with the naked eye sometimes, but it's better if you can magnify it somehow. And then make your shallow cross-sectional cuts. We saw what those buds look like. And then you can even record the results and the bud order if you wish. So you get an idea how many buds out of 10 survived. And if you got a certain amount of canes that you've collected, you can then determine, do I need to leave extra buds to compensate for damage, or do I need to plan on thinning shoots later on? You know, all these different things. So again, that's the healthy one. That's the damaged. And these are some of our actual data numbers. Going all the way back to 2008, this is 20 different varieties here, and you can see their comparison. It's pretty tough for some of you to see, I'm sure, but if you get the email, you'll probably be able to see it later. But some of these have performed very well in certain years. Obviously, like the Frontenac and the Frontenac Gris, 100% primary bud survival, 90s, high 80s, all the time, performing well. But this year, we had some pretty significant damage. So this is primary bud survival at this point. 27%, 25%, so that's like 3 buds out of 10 that survived on the canes. That's the primary bud now. Now, the way they look when they're growing this year, they look perfectly fine. The secondaries kicked in and did the job. So it's like they hardly took any damage. But it does go to show that there's significant damage in some of these varieties. Our La Crescent did pretty well with 35. Baltica up here was really pretty hardy. That's a pretty cold hardy variety. I'm not even exactly sure where that was originated. I mean, the Baltic states, maybe Estonia up there. But it is not, well, in my mind, it's not the bee's knees as far as winemaking, but it goes to show what the hardiness can be on some of these. Valiant, anybody familiar with Valiant? It's pretty hardy, but again, another disease-ridden vine, fairly foxy flavored vine, so if you like Concord as a wine, you might like this as a wine, but if you don't, that's not going to be good. The Frontenac Blanc, these are some pretty young vines right here. In the past it was 100% survival, but this year was almost 50% primary, so it's right in par with the regular Frontenacs. So you can see some of the things though, like Swenson Red, the table grape we're talking about, 0. La Crosse, 0. Lacadie Blanc, 0. Castel, 0, which I really like Castel. Look at that year between 2011 and 12, we had Castel, 100% survival. That's the year I said like we could have had Riesling upright in Minnesota in that winter, but definitely not here. So that, you can peruse that at your leisure. I'm just giving you an idea what some of the comparison. That's just primary bud survival right there. Doesn't talk about secondary bud survival, which is much greater or much better than this chart shows. How do you know if you have a primary bud or a secondary bud? Usually they're popping out maybe at the same time or maybe a little bit different stages in the springtime. But a primary shoot is always going to be in the same, the leaves are going to be in the same direction as the buds on the cane. So it's kind of something you got to think about. So if you've got a cane that goes out the shoot that comes out is going to be also in the same plane, whereas the secondary is going to be turned 90 degrees in that reference plane. So if your plane is, this is my two-dimensional plane right here, your secondary shoot is going to be growing in this third dimension, actually. So that's just one small way of seeing that. It's not that important, yes?
I don't want you to have to rush, so Brad's okay with 10 after 3.
Okay. Does it sound like I'm going quick? I don't want to. Yeah, and this is something that's just sort of like an interesting thing that you can read about and notice, but it does give you an indication then on how how fruitful are those shoots actually going to be? Are you relying more on secondaries this season than primaries? And that's known as, I guess, phyllotaxy, which would be the arrangement of the leaves. In some seasons, you'll see these secondaries actually pushing as well as the primaries, and that's sometimes a good candidate for thinning, but if you actually need to hold back the vigor of the vine, we'll sometimes keep this guy. It just depends on the season. And of course, right here you can see how fruitful a secondary shoot can be. This was the primary shoot right here, and this is the secondary shoot with just about as much fruit, right? I mean, the clusters, they don't quite have the same wing as the primary does, but it's still going to be a pretty good crop on there. So most of our hybrids have good secondary fruit set if you're relying on these shoots. This is just a slide showing how you can control the vigor of the vine by the number of shoots. So this is the same vine, this is a clone of the same vine, but they're different ages, right? But the shoots are growing at the same rate. This one has about 15 shoots on it, and this one has 45 shoots on it. That's how we keep the balance. That's how we achieve the same growth, the same amount of like shoot length on two different age vines. Because mind you, in our vineyards at work, almost every vine is like, we're working on a handful of vines that are 2 years old, and then it's like 1 or 2 vines that are old again, like 5 years old. So we're constantly jumping back and forth from ages. But this is how we handle it. You always want to try to achieve the balance to make those shoots achieve 15 leaves long if possible. And just making you aware of different shoots will increase or decrease the speed of growth on those vines. And vine capacity, like what that vine can handle, it's the balance between the roots and the shoots and the fruits of that vine. So again, just to stress it, the more shoots retained, the slower the overall growth is going to be. So with these young vines here, we have relatively few amount of shoots, but as it gets older and older, instead of having about 15 or 20 shoots on this total vine, it's going to increase into that 45, 50 bud range, depending on what that vine is showing us. Just a quick idea of how much, what the different jobs are throughout the season. So you can see up here would be the different events on the vine, the bud swell, the bloom, the veraison, and then harvest. And these are sort of my jobs that are going on at that time of year. So suckering, is happening in April, and it's overlapping into the shoot thinning, and then the shoot thinning is also overlapping into tucking of the VSP, and some leaf removal is going on at bloom or after, quite a little bit after bloom there. Combing of the vines generally going on with high cordon vines right now in July. A lot of hedging and skirting going on in both trellis styles. A little bit of fruit thinning if necessary would be happening, between June and July would be best. And that's the idea with all of that. I want to get into the varieties then, as far as just their different characteristics. Marquette, this would be a shot in our vineyard. I have my Marquette on VSP in Minnesota where we're growing, and my site is pretty low vigor. I can get away with it, but just know that VSP, vertical shoot positioning trellises, can increase shoot vigor. So if you have a vigorous site to begin with, VSP is not going to be a good system or a good match with your variety. And it also doesn't match with some of the growth habits of the vines. So a variety like Brianna will not want to go into VSP. Marquette, Frontenac, La Crescent, I got them all on VSP. They seem to do a good job for me. but they wouldn't be recommended everywhere. But Marquette, you can see we have a fairly mid-ripening time frame for that guy. It does achieve the high sugars, like you see. It also tends to retain a high TA. And the yields are a little bit lower in comparison to some of the other things. My own vineyard pulling, in the last couple years, like 2.5 to 3.5 tons is kind of average, maybe 3 tons per acre. Whereas the Frontenacs, you're easily seeing those get into more like 4, even 5 tons per acre readily. But that also is impacting our chemistry. The heavier the crop, the more you're pushing those vines for the Frontenacs, the harder it's holding on to that chemistry of the acid. It's not dropping the acid as easily. It's hardy. Marquette is pretty hardy, although it did take quite a bit of a hit this year in Minnesota vineyards, so we're seeing that. You can do spur pruning with this guy. You can do cane pruning as well, but either way, I think the spur pruning on VSP fits nicer. It does well with cane pruning on high cordon. Usually it's very open growth habit and nice. And like I said, it's got this intermediate growth, so you can go the VSP or the high cordon if you wish. It does get quite a bit of black rot on its leaves, and it can get quite a bit of black rot on the fruit on a bad year like this. So just to be aware, with the early spray program, we talked about using some of those chemicals early on. That's going to be the key to keeping it clean. You get to this point in the season, if you've done a good job with your sprays, it's going to be nice at this point and beyond. And like I said, cane pruning, good for some seasons. It depends on, again, if you had a hard winter and you think there's a lot of bud damage, you don't want to be doing cane pruning. You got to rely on the basal buds that are a little more hardy, or those backup buds that are the reserve buds that are closer to the cordons. So the shoot vigor is increasing with that VSP, as you can see. I have trouble keeping these guys, keeping enough fruit on them and slowing their shoots enough on top here. The canopy gets to be about, well, it's higher than I can reach, but from base of the shoot to the top of the shoot where I pruned it is like 4.5 feet long, and I have to go through like twice or 3 times, even maybe a 4th time per season to trim off these shoots up top here. But VSP does improve the wood ripening, I've noticed. So there's pros and cons to all of this, but in general the yield is lower with the VSP. So it's a trade-off, right? A lot of times with the high cordon system, because of the apical dominance is lost, the shoots are growing downward. You see this ripening happening from the base of the shoot working toward the tip of the shoot, and at some point it's not going to go anymore because the season is just, well, you hit a frost date or something. And I've seen Marquette be particularly troublesome sometimes in ripening its wood, and La Crescent for that matter too, can sometimes have trouble ripening its wood when it's pointing down. Now you guys might be better off down here where it's warmer, you got more heat available, but for me, being central Minnesota, my latitude is about 40, almost 45, it's 44 point something. No, yeah, I think so. I'd have to double check that, but we're pretty high up there, so if I can increase my vine ripening by putting on VSP, that's what's helping me out. Okay, other features, the bud break is relatively early on Marquette, so you do have some issue with spring frost, can be. And the bloom is typically early to mid in June, somewhere in there. The shoot tips are distinguished like yellow-green with some bronzy red in there, so they're pretty attractive shoot tips. And the leaves, pretty broad and smooth. Your margins are very sawtoothed and they're not very deeply lobed, so they look kind of like wild grape vines. Lots of tendrils, right? Lots of lateral shoots. We're seeing a lot of strong growth coming on the Marquettes. We're spending quite a bit of extra time if we're doing the combing. You know, it takes a while. Your shoots have to be sort of lignified enough for you to do the combing job, which is like you're doing it now. But by this time in the season, those tendrils are already grabbing onto each other. So the combing is just that much harder. So we try to situate the buds as best as possible with our spur pruning to begin with, and that sort of alleviates that need for a lot of combing, but we still have to. The clusters are smaller than Frontenac, and it's generally 2 per shoot, whereas the Frontenacs are generally 3 per shoot. And they are susceptible to powdery mildew and black rot, the Marquette is. So that's why the powdery mildew comes on this time of year and into August pretty heavily, so again, hitting that stuff with some of those things that we talked about, maybe mill stop, for example. As you're getting closer to harvest, it's a little bit more organic of a spray. It can eradicate and stop that mildew right there. And anybody that's ever pruned these vines for hours and hours on end, you can realize how dense and hard that wood can be. So keep a sharp pruner's on. Because I usually wrap my wrist with an ace bandage. And me and my wife, we both do it. We wrap our wrists all the way up to our elbows. And it just seems to help hold our tendons together, because you can see the tendons will pop out a little bit more when they're not bound together. So it's just one tactic to avoid carpal tunnel, I guess. Shoots, you can do the training. They're fairly upright early in the season, so the VSP does work. But again, only on low organic matter sites. If it's high vigor sites, like with high water holding capacity, you should either avoid it or you got to move on to the high cordon training system, which many of us are doing anyway. The lateral shoots are needed to be removed for good fruit exposure if you want that on the high cordon trained vines, because as the shoots are pointing down, those lateral shoots are still trying to grow upward and they're causing a lot of shade. Now maybe it's not the worst thing in a warmer region. Maybe Marquette might like to be a little bit more shaded, so you got to play with that in your own vineyards and see how that chemistry is coming along and work with your wineries closely with that so you can both learn what's the best tactic. Because if we don't have to do as much lateral thinning, that's less work in the vineyard, and if it's improving the wine, well, then it's a win-win. So everybody's saving time and money and everybody's making better wine, and that's good. But we don't know all those things. There's lots to learn about this still. Canes, I never let canes more than 10 to 12 buds long if you're going to lay a fresh cane out, because any longer than that, you get a lot of those missing nodes like we talked about, and 15, 20 nodes long, it's too many. You're going to get too many misfires along the way. They perform well after a mild winter, but colder winters it's not as good. Basal buds and the spurs are somewhat fruitful, as we've seen, so Marquette is a candidate for, if you have to rely on cordons and all that, you can still get some pretty good fruit off of those cordons, even if the spur isn't quite working right. Our vine spacing is typically like 6 feet when the organic matter is less than 2.5%, but if it's over 3% organic matter, it's 8 foot. In between there, you can kind of decide for yourself, I guess, what you want to go with, but that works well because a 24-foot post set in the ground, you can either choose 6 or 8 feet, and you get 4 vines in a panel or 3 vines in a panel. If you're going to go 7 feet between vines, then you got a 21-foot spacing between your posts, and that's the only option you got. This is just a progression of my pruning in our vineyard, in my own vineyard, of a couple of years. Every time I came by this vine, it was so strikingly textbook to me that I took some photos, and it was like, here's 2011, just growing beautifully the way it needed to. Coming to the pruning of 2012, here's what it looked like. We're recreating the same scenario, 2 bud spurs. Here's how it grew that next season. We got the same effect. It looked just like it did 2 years ago. And then we pruned it up like that. And during the growing season, it was filled in like this, just nicely hanging fruit, tucked in the catch wires and whatnot. And then we come to this year, and it's like, I didn't prune it nicely. I didn't do the 2 bud spurs. I just did a rough cut prune. I cut right below my first pair of catch wires, which is right here. And I just buzzed it with a little hedger, and I left all my shoots possible because I knew I had so much damage on my Marquette. But this is central Minnesota, and this is how well it's still performing. So I'd give that still a B for its growth, or maybe even an A for the shoot growth, but I'd give it a C for the fruit. There's not much fruit in there. You can see a couple of clusters in here, but in general, the fruit is way down in my crop compared to last year. So it's a rebuilding year as far as that goes. Next year I'll be up and running again, granted that we have a good winter. Here again, that's what that rough pruning looked like. I was kind of concerned that it was looking pretty rough. This isn't a lot of shoots on there, so this was one of the more injured vines, and there might be a little bit of injury in my trunks, but they did come along nicely after this. This was the previous year, though. This is how nice it did look, the previous season. I had actually gone in there and shoot thinned, and I had my maybe 6 buds per trellis foot, sometimes 7 or 8 at the most. But it's just working out really well. So you can see every year is a little bit different. This year I'm not doing any shoot thinning. I'm just letting that shoots grow up and we'll fix it with pruning, so to speak. Here again, with the fruit, Marquette generally doesn't need a lot of fruit thinning because it is such a light yielder, and especially on VSP, I don't really need to thin that guy down anymore because the fruit's not as much. So that's kind of what we're looking at. But in this photo, you see all the lateral shoots are removed in that fruit zone, so it is fairly nice and open. Now I'm not sure if that's the best thing or not because my bricks were getting plenty high in these grapes, and my acid was still staying plenty high too. So I'm struggling to figure out which way should I go with this. Should I leave it a little more covered? Will it still make a good wine? You know, these are the things that you guys can play around with too. But here was that 2013 season when everything was working well. Nice fruit along here. 15 node shoots, 4.5 feet in length pretty much, and then hedged. So my trellis wire is somewhere here. I let these shoots another good 12 to 14 inches above that trellis wire still before I hedge them.
Do you have a vertical hedger?
No, it's just like not on the side. It's not like a.
This looks so perfect.
Well, we make sure that the shoots are tucked in there very nicely, and a couple of lateral shoots that pop out, we can pull those. But this is all done by hand so far. I only got like 4 acres. I'm trying to invest in new equipment, but I can't justify it quite yet. I get the job done. I would love to have a nice hedger, like the rotating blades and just doing the job right. Someday. Yeah, so this is a shot from this season. The yield is down. You can see the clusters are hanging there though, but this is Marquette and it's growing plenty. But the shoots are not held back as much because the growth is so vigorous in this year and the fruit isn't quite there. But we'll get that vine back into balance in the upcoming season. This is what Marquette then on high cordon can look like. I know the light might not be the best to see it, but the fruit is in this nice zone right here, just like we've seen these vines out here. They look really good, by the way. We've been doing a good job on those, and whoever's been helping. Nice vines, nice open growth, letting the shoots grow down to here. I generally hedge them when they're about 1.5 feet from the ground, just so I can have airflow under there and I can do my floor management, keep the weeds clean. But I want to achieve shoots that are, again, 4.5, 5 foot in length, so I have the proper amount of leaves, not only to ripen the fruit, but to ripen the wood. It's just as important as the fruit, is to get that wood ripening for hardiness. And again, allowing that fruit to ripen. Last year we had a cool season in Minnesota. You guys might have been warm down here, but we were cool all the way around. So I didn't pick it until September 29th in 2013. Whereas the previous year, I was already done with my Frontenac on September 28th. So it just goes to show what a difference in a year can be. And this is how, I'm talking about how narrow and neat that was looking. We achieved that with these catch wire clips and the VSP, and all shoots are caught in these catch wires. So, and then just up here, they can spread out a little bit, but you can see the line for the wire, and then how much further they're growing beyond the top wire there. All right, on to La Crescent. It's kind of a mid-ripening variety, and it's got the high sugars and the high TA again, like we've seen with Marquette. Medium yields. It's hardy. It can be pretty hardy. What I really want to show you about is the tandem pruning. I'll get to some of those slides that I like to play with this guy. This is what keeps my vines going in central Minnesota, is this technique of, people call it spare parts pruning, dirty pruning. I have a term called tandem pruning where we lay canes down with cordons. That's kind of a fun technique to keep things on rotation, essentially, and keep them young and refreshed. And it's very susceptible to downy mildew, so that's one of the downfalls of it. But full sun exposure with this guy gives the best flavors and aromas in La Crescent, in my mind. You get that beautiful muscat notes coming out, whereas if it's in the canopy, it just doesn't get as nice, that fruit. We'll see some of that. There's a bunch of facts and figures. I mean, I'll let you read through some of these on your own, but it's kind of like I went through with Marquette, different things. The tendrils are much more moderate on La Crescent. It does have a lot of lateral growth. They can be strong. Mildew again, but the wood is much less dense. So when you're pruning, it's like cutting through a spongy wood compared to the hardness of Frontenac or Marquette. Again, different sites, avoid the vigorous sites with high water holding capacity, that's the detriment of La Crescent. If it's got high water available to it and lots of nitrogen, all those vines always go to the ground in Minnesota. And we have a lot of growers struggling with it that way. 10 to 12 buds, basal buds, pretty fruitful. Same things down here. So here's a progression of pruning. The snow was pretty deep here. I'm standing about 2 inches higher than, 2 feet higher than normal. But I pruned the one side as a bunch of spurs, and then I filled in some of the gaps, some of the gaps here with extra canes. That's what I'm terming my tandem pruning. I got this cane, and that cane is going to get laid down with the cordon, as you'll see. So right here, instead of having it just shooting up in the air, I'm trying to get so that all of my buds are at the same starting line at the beginning of the season, which means they have to start from this cordon wire as much as possible. So spare parts, tandem pruning, whatever you want to call it. We're just keeping extra trunks, canes, spurs, whatever we can do, and we keep it in a controlled rotation. So everything is still straightly trained. It's just that I phase one out over time as I'm phasing a new one in. And the phase-in process, phase-out process can take like 2-3 years, but it works. It's what's keeping my La Crescent, and La Crescent is bringing a premium price for us right now.
So then next year, you would cut off?
Yeah, I might go back and cut off like one of these trunks that's older while I've got a younger trunk coming in place, or I might cut off one of the cordons here to ease it up a little bit, depending on how well this new one survives. If it's a good survivor and it's got good spur positions, yeah, I can go for him, but you know, every vine has to be played with differently. So it's much more thought processed pruning than just simple telling your guy, I want 30 buds on this vine. You really got to know what you're doing at that point. It's kind of like vineyard gymnastics or something, or acrobatics. Now this was my vineyard this season. You can see the La Crescent in the wetter zones. This is the lower part of my vineyard. Not so hot on top here, although it did survive to an extent. But I am leaving a lot of suckers, and I am training, you know, I'm trying to keep the moderate growing ones. This tall one here, he's going to be a bull cane by the end of the season. And some of these shorter ones down here might be too short, but I'm trying to keep those Goldilocks ones by keeping a large number of canes so that when I go to prune next year, after this season is over, and I go to prune next spring, I can choose my Goldilocks trunks out of this selection, out of this assortment right here. When it all works well, here again, we're making sure that we got those La Crescents tipped on VSP. They do go into VSP really nicely, but again, you got to have the soil for it. Like, if you can find sandy or gravelly soil around here, it might be beneficial for you to try it that way. Here's how nice and exposed we can get it. All the leaves are doing the work so nicely here. These leaves are actually turning yellow and senescing to some extent, and the fruit is, we did expose the fruit nicely. We pulled off maybe 1 or 2 leaves per shoot in this zone. We don't take everything off. We want to leave some, but I want those clusters exposed, the better, because it gets this, I made this word up, by the way. It's not Vergoldnung. Does it exist in German? You can answer that, but it just means like the goldening, the berries are goldening up, and that's what I'm looking for, because you get a nice muscat development from that. If you got a canopy that's really dense and shady, you're only going to get these emeralds. Like this is the same date, and these green berries are never going to taste as nice as these exposed berries on La Crescent, okay? So it's very important to get that exposed. On a hot year, like 2012 was super hot, we tried to keep more leaves and keep them in the shade a little bit more because they were just roasting. They were getting too much sun at that point, and then they were starting to shell early. And you guys have seen that problem maybe. Okay, Frontenac Blanc. This is one of those sports that's been rising up from many different vines. People have been reporting it in a number of different vineyards coming from their Gris vines generally. It was first observed in Canada. It's been found independently in the United States numerous times. I've had reversions going back to black. In fact, these are all shots from my own vineyard, where if you're looking carefully during harvest, you'll see them sometimes bicolored clusters or even bicolored berries. This one is Gris, where the cluster went to black again. So it's always interesting. If you see these mutations happening, these half cluster things, these halflings, they're not that interesting. But if you see a full cluster, like a fully white cluster shoot, you know, that's worth noting and maybe propagating, because it might have better chemistry And especially if the black is coming from the gray, we might see some better chemistry, some better ripening on these. So just keep that in mind for those that are growing any Frontenac family vine.
You would do that off a shoot.
You would take that shoot, you'd have to mark it before you picked it, because once you pick it, you don't know what it is anymore. So make sure you flag this shoot, and then go back and harvest it when you prune or sometime in the middle of winter, and then propagate it in the springtime. That's what we would be doing. So as far as Frontenac Blanc, it's a very late ripener again, like the rest of the Frontenac. High sugar, high TA, heavy yields generally. This is like a 5-year-old vine with a lot of fruit on it. But it's got that intermediate growth, so it can go high cordon like it is here, or into the VSP if you want. It's got very good resistance to downy mildew. I don't think you ever see downy mildew on its leaves, but it will get powdery mildew and black rot and some of those others. But again, it's very disease resistant in comparison to some of the other varieties that are out there. The bud break is later than Marquette, but interestingly enough, the bloom is before Marquette. So that's kind of cool. I mean, you don't always see that happening. Shoot tips are very green, so it's easy to distinguish it. Tendrils are very minimal. It just falls out of the trellis wires, even on VSP when I'm pruning it, so that's nice. You don't have to spend a lot of work tearing it apart during pruning. And often 3 clusters per shoot, so it does need that thinning once in a while of that 3rd cluster. And again, the wood is very dense. A lot of powdery mildew, a lot of phylloxera, of course. We've talked about how to deal with the phylloxera, some of those chemicals in a rotation, the Movento or the Aceal. It can work, Danitol. But the Movento, I've been having good results with the Movento, I guess. Same things. Wet, high vigor sites just don't do good, and low organic sites generally bring out the fruit character a lot nicer. So that's kind of like a commonality with all the grape growing. That's why you look at Europe and such, and those great places, anywhere where it's like valley floor and flat, that's where your grains have been growing, right? The beer making stuff. On the craggly hillside rocks where almost nothing can grow, that's where your apple orchards and your vineyards go, because it's a perennial plant. It likes to struggle, and it brings out the character much better in those kind of soil types. Here's showing how you can prune it as a VSP if you want, keeping about 6 buds per trellis foot. It worked really well for 2013. But this season, again, I did the rough prune, and I'm just letting whatever come. And it's not bad. Like, I'm pretty happy with this up top, although the fruit isn't very good. But we did have minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit this past winter. And it's all right. Sometimes I'm suckering, sometimes I don't even need it. For the Frontenacs, they're super hardy, so it's getting the job done. The one thing about VSP, though, is the Frontenacs have very uneven shoot growth. So there'll be some shoots that achieve the top wire, and then there'll be a whole host of other ones that are just way shoot and way leg behind. So that's kind of difficult to handle as far as VSP. So you might think it probably is more suited to the high wire than anything. Again, your phylloxera issue here. This is where phylloxera was here. I sprayed Danitol. The leaves were clean for like 3 leaves, and then it got phylloxera again. So it just, it pauses and takes a breath, and then they recoup. The troops gather, and then they come out again. Cane pruning can work, but it's you got much more sparse fruit set when you do canes versus cordons. So, but it does make a nice naturally thin canopy if you're doing cane pruning. You can get this raisining going on a hot year. This was Frontenac Blanc on a very hot season, and super exposed fruit, and maybe on a sandy site on top of it. So you got to be aware of that a little bit. But I don't see it as a big negative, other than it might be hard to process somewhat, but actually it makes cool flavors. The flavors were much more interesting for my palate than just the regular old wine. These were some of the numbers in the past couple years, which, very interestingly enough, when it was so hot that year, we had really high bricks, but the acid stayed really high. And then last year, I can't figure this one out yet, but cooler year, lower bricks, but the acid was lower. You would have thought that the acid would have been higher, but it wasn't. And so this stuff was picked. This would be like our standard pick, and then this was a late harvest pick. So it was picked here September 11th and September 30th. And then here again, it was picked on October 8th and October 11th. So looking at the acids aren't changing much. I mean, that's almost negligible difference. I mean, it is a little bit, but okay. Getting real close here. I want to just see the chemistry or the wine character of La Cresse, or Frontenac Blanc, I should say. Nice color, really nice aromas on the standard stuff with, you know, a little bit more green fruit, so you're getting citrus, lemon, piney stuff. I have 2 examples here today that we're going to try pretty soon. One is from the standard, one is from the late harvest. They're both done in a dry manner. It's just the difference in dates, so we're trying to keep those things equal. But when it was later harvest, you're getting more of the pineapple, the tropical fruit, the honey, the cantaloupe, the guava, all that good stuff is coming out, whereas on the standard one, it's more like eucalyptus and gooseberry. So, Petite Pearl, I don't have a lot of information on Petite Pearl, but this was a photo from Shelburne Vineyards in Vermont. These were really nice clusters hanging there, and I saw some really nice clusters hanging out here. So I was quite impressed with it. It does have that tightness, so we have to watch that as it goes forward, that we don't get a lot of berry splitting, because that could be detrimental. But other than that, I think the yields, I always thought it would be kind of low, but you're saying you're cutting off 2 more clusters on those shoots. It may be, actually it's probably more moderate to high yield then. But the nice thing about it is the sugars and the TA are much more moderate than some of our other varieties. And this is a Tom Plocker introduction, so he's an independent breeder. Not affiliated with the University of Minnesota, but it's doing pretty nice, and people are playing around with it and just starting to get to know it right now. So there's a lot of potential, but I did notice it did have black rot out there and anthracnose, and they had quite a spring like we did too. Same thing, we talked about that. So all in all, the perfect grapes are just really hard to come by, and you know, someday we can achieve this. In fact, we do have this sometimes, but not every vine. So. With that, I appreciate your attention. I know we ran a little bit long, but thanks to both of the grower groups for having me come down here. I'm very thrilled to be here.